Imagine you live in a remote northern First Nation community with 400 other people. Your First Nations community has stewarded these northern lands from time immemorial. But the community has a boiled water advisory and there's little economic development. Its housing and community buildings are inadequate. There's an old nursing station, but no resident nurse. It is hard to find teachers for the school. Residents on the reserve need to fly out for many services. Year after year, your community must ask Indigenous Services Canada for funding and is unable to do long-term planning. There is no director of finance, accounting firms aren't interested in the work, or it's unaffordable. The annual audits exhaust the finance staff, and the financial statements are often delivered late. The community doesn't know how the administration is doing, and optimism is low. Just 200 kilometers away, a more prosperous settler lumber town is accessible only by a poorly maintained Forest Service road. It has a small hospital, school, and a road to the south. You and your neighbors want to share in that prosperity. There's talk of valuable mineral resources in your territory, but without real information or consultation about the project and how your community will benefit, the nation will not consent to any development. To improve their situation, the nation decides to make use of the RoadMap project. RoadMap provides optional pathways to support First Nations as they move from managing poverty to creating wealth. It supports First Nations' rights to self-govern and builds capacity for economic development. Fast forward to 2030. The nation has partnered with a mining company to extract gold on its traditional territory. After an analysis of environmental risks and financial opportunities, the consent of the community was granted, and the nation negotiated a significant equity ownership in the mine. With consulting and advice from the Indigenous Economic Council, your community now has several Indigenous-owned businesses servicing the mine. A revenue sharing agreement with Canada and royalties from the mine means the community has invested in education and skills development for the youth and dedicated programs to care for their elders. It is also building long-term wealth managed by a world-class national Indigenous-owned and operated pension and asset manager. The First Nations Statistical and Data Initiative helps the nation to plan for service delivery and measure progress. The mine has an administrative office in town as well as warehouses and staging facilities, which pay property tax to the nation through the First Nations Tax Commission's legislation. This creates revenue for further investments in the nation. The growth in your community also benefits the nearby settler town through purchasing and investment. Fast forward to 2040. Your community is now realizing many of its goals. Together you have made it healthier, happier, and more prosperous. Your First Nation now has a fiscal transfer agreement with Canada like the provincial transfers. This revenue has funded a hospital and a high school for your community, financed by monetizing the transfers and borrowing at low rates through the First Nations Finance Authority. Your tribal council has worked together to create housing, health, and water authorities. These services are now regulated by an Indigenous quality regulator and an Indigenous financial regulator. The First Nations Infrastructure Institute advises Council on best practices and procedures for constructing, financing, and maintaining buildings and other community infrastructure over their life cycle. A joint venture with the Indigenous Development Bank and the mine brings high-speed internet and a paved road to the community, connecting it to the outside world. Members of your community that have moved away for education and employment have moved back home. Now there's opportunity, infrastructure, services, and they are reconnecting with their territory and leading nation building. Children in the community have a top-rate education through a combination of local and remote learning, including education in your language. The FMB also supports your community in maintaining administrative and financial governance practices that meet international standards. Imagine you live in a remote northern First Nations community, working together and accessing the free and optional tools and resources of the Fiscal Management Act. Your community is now connected to the rest of Canada. The nation is now asserting more self-government rights, taking over jurisdictions from the province with a now thriving economy and a fiscal relationship based on long-term sustainable revenue. The Fiscal Management Act institutions believe that this vision for a better future can become a reality for First Nation governments across Canada. Learn more about the RoadMap project, a practical framework for Indigenous economic reconciliation.